Never be forsaken. Episode number 5 of the 7 Promises Made to Believers.
620 Live, so that we may all speak boldly.
Let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as ye have. For he hath said, I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5.
You know, in a world that is all about self, all about me, and all about I, and that the bigger something is, the better that it is. You know, for instance, the new iPhone comes out, and the majority of people have to go pay easily over $700 to have it, or get it on a payment plan, or the newest Droid phone, or newest TV, or whatever it is. It's like we aren't content with what we have. If I have a nice car, I want a nicer car. If I have a nice computer, I want a nicer computer. And we constantly are trying to improve because we're not content. Now, I pray that you will stick with me through this podcast, because there's definitely some stuff that needs to be explained, and hopefully I can do a good enough job of this. But regardless of what the situation is, or regardless of what the thing is, the majority of us are not content. And I think that leads to a lot of people doing drugs or alcohol or, something else, because we're not content in what we have, or what, is given to us. Now, I don't want you to take that and think that I'm saying that there's something wrong with trying to better yourself or better your situation, because there is absolutely nothing wrong with trying to better yourself. There's nothing wrong with getting a newer computer if your other one is not doing what it needs to do. There's nothing wrong with getting a newer phone if the apps that you constantly use are not working on the old model. There's nothing wrong with striving to better yourself, better your circumstances, or better your situation. Where we come into fault, where we begin to do wrong or go astray, is whenever we do things like this at the expense of our relationship with God. Say you have a good job and you're making a good amount of money, but you want to make a little bit more. Again, nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But say you're making $10,000, a month, working Monday through Friday, but you could make $12,000 a month working, Monday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Now, I know there's some times when working on Sunday cannot be helped. That's understandable. That's, the job that we have. But when you're sacrificing that on purpose to get a better job, and that's when I think we get into some issues there. Now, if you're, transferred or something like that, and then your schedule changes, that's beyond your control. But when it's come to something being in your control and you do it, and that sacrifices your relationship, that's when, you're not being content. You were making it on the $10,000 a month. Yeah, $12,000 a month would help you make it easier, make things better. But if you're making it at $10,000, is sacrificing your relationship with God really worth $2,000 extra a month? I mean, that's a lot of money, Well, for most of us, it's a lot of money, but is it really worth sacrificing your relationship? That's kind of it's kind of putting a price on God and your relationship with Him, and that's just not cool. Yeah, it's not fun, it's not nice, it's definitely not part of growing closer to God. And I want to stress the fact that it's perfectly fine for you to climb the ladder of success, to want a better house, or to want all that. That's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with wanting to better yourself. Again, and I will repeat this several times during this episode because it's in my notes several times, because it's truly important that we don't need to sacrifice our relationship with God to better ourselves like that. We need to be content with what we have. Sacrifice that $2,000 for a closer walk with Jesus. There's nothing on this world or nothing on this earth that is worth sacrificing our relationship with God. There's absolutely nothing worth that. And you can name anything that you want to name. I give you free rein to name whatever. Nothing is worth sacrificing your relationship with God. And I really want to point out, because this has been coming up for me so much here lately, and I know God is speaking to me about this, because I want this podcast to grow. I want it to reach other people. I want people to know about it, to know, to come to know God, to hear more about Him. But it's not worth sacrificing my beliefs or sacrificing my relationship with God for this podcast to grow. It's not worth it. And here's what's been coming up for me a lot lately is the relationship with David, and looking at him and Saul, and it kind of makes me want to do a deeper study into that, as whenever we get near the end of the Seven Nevers. But I'm also really wanting to dig really deep into the spiritual armor, the holy armor of God. But that's for something else that we can talk about later. But I want to talk about King Saul and David's relationship. Now, keep in mind that Saul was made king of Israel because they wanted a king. They were tired of the judges. But also, don't forget that when Saul and the Israelite army were facing off against Goliath and the Philistines, that Saul would not even go forth and to do battle. However, when David showed up with, food and, who knows what else for his brothers and those who were near his brothers, David wasn't scared of facing Goliath. Saul even put his armor on him, but David refused it, and he went to face Goliath armed just with, a sling and a stone, because David had taken care of the sheep back home. Now this, earned him the respect of the Israelite army and of King Saul, and eventually David and Jonathan became friends, and I think it probably took a little bit for Saul to begin to love David, or to love David, period. Because there's a difference between liking someone and loving someone, just as there's a difference between loving someone and being in love with someone. But regardless, it likely took, King Saul a little bit to begin to love David. And in my head, in my mind, I see Saul and, watching David and Jonathan become, like we used to say when we were kids, blood brothers. I think that's probably what, brought Saul over to David's, side. But David kept doing David kind of things. He would go out and fight in the battles, and and would kill his enemies, and he would be given credit by the crowds back at the castle and surrounding areas where Saul could hear of Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his 10,000s. Now this is not something that would endure. That really ain't the word that I want to use here, and I'm sure some of you listening are like, yeah, this is the word, this is the word. But it would not cause Saul to like David anymore, than he already did. And in fact, it had quite the opposite effect, because King Saul here got extremely jealous. To the point, I won't even say envious, but I will say that he was probably jealous, and in fact to the point of anger, as he did try to kill David twice by throwing his spear and trying to pin him to the wall. Saul heard the crowds and the cheering and the dancing about David killing his 10,000, while they only accredited King Saul with thousands. And I can't help but feel and believe that David was just striving to be the best that he could be, which is what we try to do, or what we should try to do. Yes, again, be content with what you have, because you may not get what you're striving for, so you need to be happy and content with what you have now. David, he just, like I said, he just strove to be the best that he could be, and David was a really good man. Yes, he made mistakes, but he was a really good man, because he had opportunity to kill Saul. Remember in the cave when Saul's in there using the bathroom, and trivia, fun fact here, it's the only reference to someone actually using the bathroom in the Bible, in the cave. There's mentions of like stomach rumblings and things like that, but this is the only actual use of, someone actually using the bathroom. And Saul was in there, he thought, by himself, but David could have killed him right there as he was, relieving himself, but David did not. I mean, Saul continually pursued David for a long time. I think around 10 years. It may have been a little bit more, may have been a little bit less. I don't have that particular thing in my notes, but it just popped in my head. But Saul continually strove to kill David, while David continually strove that he would not kill God's appointed man, because Saul was, appointed by God, and David was not going to do anything to Saul. But, and like I said, David was a good man, but he still made mistakes. He always strove to be the best version of himself that he could be, but he wasn't always content with what he had. And this is never more apparent than when he went after Bathsheba. I'm trying to think, he wanted her, he desired her, and she was married to one of his high-ranking officials. But yet, David didn't care. He saw her, he wanted her, he desired her, and by golly, he was the king, and he could have her, and did have her. He wasn't content with those that he had around him. He wanted more. He wanted her. And I'm not saying she was an ugly person by any means. I don't know. But he desired her. And a lot of it probably had to do with the fact that she was married too, because I've often heard that no one is more desirable than when they're married. They're like a, forbidden fruit. And, David had the power to have her. He wanted more. He wanted her. He knew that he could have her, so he did have her. And in that, he stepped beyond his relationship with God. He went with the carnal feelings. He went with his human fleshly desire to have her. And again, I repeat to you that wanting more in the aspect of, striving to better yourself is perfectly fine. But again, not at the sacrifice of your relationship with God. It's just not worth it. Because when David did this, going beyond his contentment, they had a child together that died. And while that is sorrowful that the child died, it just goes to show that doing something like David did with her is not biblical, because she was already married and promised to another. I mean, it was an adulterous affair. It was an adulterous relationship. And not only did David lose his son with her, he also lost one of his high-ranking officials, because he sent him into the fiercest part of the battle so that he would be killed. And I'm sorry that I don't have his name right here. It's in my head. I just cannot remember it. And it's not in my notes because I hadn't planned to mention his name. But he sent him out there to die. And he had tried to get him to sleep with, his wife beforehand, but he would not, because, he was really honorable, and his men that he was over in the army could not be with their family, so he would not be either. And I want to talk a little bit about contentment. While contentment is good, and that's what this verse is about, is being content with what you have, it's not a good thing to be content in your relationship with God. Contentment in your earthly possessions and things like that is, is good. But just being content in your relationship with God is not a good thing, because look at it like this. It's like you get saved and that's all you ever do. You're like, I have my ticket. I'm getting into heaven. I'm just going to go sit here in the recliner until I die. Or I'm going to go lay on the couch until I die. That's not good, folks, because, we need to strive to be closer to God. We need to strive to have a closer relationship with Him, a closer walk with Him. And, we can't get that by just accepting Him as our Savior and that's it. We have to get that through reading, studying, through trials, through tribulations, through going to church, and, doing our best to grow closer to Him by studying Him. I mean, don't you want to know more about the guy that died for you, the Savior that died for you? Don't you want to know more about Him? I mean, I do. I think we all should, or, to put it bluntly, if we don't want a closer walk with Jesus, then we might need to check our salvation. Make sure it's real, because if it's real, you want that closer walk. You want to read more about Him. You want to study more about Him. It's not an easy thing for me to describe, because it's like I get all kind of lost in my head, but I don't understand somebody who is saved that doesn't want a closer walk with him. And again, as always, be careful of who you read or who you listen to. You know, nothing is better than the Holy Bible to read and to grow closer to God. The study guides are good, podcasts are good, you know, all that is good, but, you know, the Bible is, what's the word, infallible, unfallible. You know, there's no mistakes in it. While these study guides and podcasts, including this one, you know, the people that wrote these are all human. You know, we do make mistakes. We may interpret something wrong. You know, but there's nothing wrong about the Bible. There's nothing wrong in the Bible. So, what better place to go to grow closer to Him and to learn more about Him? And again, you know, you're welcome to listen to podcasts and study guides. Just be careful. But in all things, go back to your Bible and second check, or, you know, triple check, or, you know, go over it again, just to be sure. You know, the one thing that, you know, I talked about us being content, and there's nothing wrong with striving to be better. We need to keep a very careful check on jealousy, because jealousy is a real thing. You know, I believe that we've all dealt with it, you know, and come across it. So, you know, it's really easy to fall into, because it's one of Satan's favorite weapons. You know, that he can use jealousy to, you know, cause us to slip, and, you know, all it takes is one slip before you're falling down the slope. Yeah, and I want us to look at James 3:16. Many of us can quote John 3:16, but let's see what James 3:16 has to say here.
For wherein vain and strife is, there is confusion in every evil work. James chapter 3 verse 16.
I hope me doing those voiceovers doesn't bother anybody, but I can go back to reading them if people, you know, would prefer that. But it's really hard for me not to bust out with a Yoda line here, because if anybody knows me, I'm a big Star Wars fan. In fact, I recently just got through watching them all again. I just love them. But anyway, I could really do a Yoda line here about, you know, the jealousy leading to the dark side, and, you know, jealousy leads to envy to the dark side. But, you know, this is kind of one that would be really funny to have Yoda saying something like that. This is a very serious thing, because, you know, jealousy is a sin. And the seriousness of it being a sin is very apparent, because all it takes is one little bit of jealousy before, I mean, like I said, you're going down that hill. You know, a lot of the theft and armed robbery comes because people are jealous of what other people have, and they're going to get it or get something better at whatever cost, you know, it is. This, and like I said, this ain't good. You know, and to point back at David, look at him and Bathsheba. You know, he wanted her, he took her, and he committed, you know, multiple sins there. You know, lusting, sleeping with another man's wife. He sent, you know, her husband off to be murdered. That makes, he's guilty of killing. You know, and that's just 3. You know, that one little bit, or one iota, as we'll say down here, and look what it did. It cost the baby his life, and it cost, you know, Bathsheba's husband her life, and it cost David a good high-ranking official. You know, do you see how jealousy can be like hugely bad? Almost necrotic, because it keeps growing and growing, like, and it takes a lot to stop it. And some of the places that I looked at whenever I was, studying for this and going over things, some of the commentaries state that having Jesus is enough. And I've talked about this a little bit earlier in the podcast, but yes, having Jesus is enough to get you into heaven. It covers the most basic part. It gets you your ticket into heaven. But how can someone not want to grow closer to Him? How can someone not want to know more about Him? More about where we came from, like in the Old Testament. The history. How can people not want to know more? How can people not want to desire more? And I understand that we're all different, and we all learn and read and do all this at different levels or different paces. But, as long as you're doing it, doesn't really matter what pace you're doing at, because we all learn differently and at different rates. And I just ask, don't you want to know more about the one who died for you? And I guess this is like a little briefing here, we should never covet money, possessions, items, what somebody else has. We should never covet that and be jealous of that. We should be happy for them that they have that. My friend gets a brand new house. I'm not jealous. I'm so happy that, things are going good for him. The same if somebody that I know gets a car, or starts up a new business, or whatever the case is. I'm so thankful that it has taken place for them. Am I envious? No. Am I jealous? No. I'm happy and content in what I have and with what I have. Again, and I know I've said this repeatedly here in this podcast, but it is okay to want to better yourself, just not at the cost of your relationship with God. That should be first and foremost when you're even thinking about bettering yourself. Is it going to cause a rift or a tear in your relationship with God? If so, then back away. The greatest thing though that we can find in this verse is that Christ will never forsake us. He will never leave us. And no amount of money that you can earn or be given to you or win or find or whatever to get, no possessions, no material things, none of this earthly wealth could ever be greater than knowing that Jesus Christ will never leave us.
Prince in the Sand by Mary Stevenson, Will Earthwormers, or Margaret Fishback Powers. All the ship is debated, as I was walking along the beach with my lord. Across the dark sky flashed scenes from my life. At each scene, I noticed two sets of footprints in the sand, one belonging to me and one to my lord. After the last scene of my life flashed before me, I looked back at the footprints in the sand. I noticed that many times along the path of my life, especially at the very lowest and saddest times, there was only one set of footprints. This really troubled me, so I asked the Lord about it. Lord, you said once I decided to follow you, you'd walk with me all the way. But I noticed that during the saddest and most troublesome times of my life, there's only one set of footprints. I don't understand why. When I needed you the most, you would leave me. He whispered, my precious child, I love you and will never leave you. Never, ever, during your trials and testings, When you saw only our set of footprints, it was then that I carried you.
Hey, thank you for listening to the podcast. You know, it means a lot to me. I just ask that you please like, share, rate, review, and if you want to keep up with each and every one of the podcasts, be sure to subscribe as well. You can visit us on the web at www.620lifepodcast.com. Again, that's www.620lifepodcast.com.